What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the fall of the House of X, the end of the X-Men. And as always, if you need to get caught up, you'll find a link to the playlist at the end of this video. But like we've discussed, right, Orchis is the organization that was tracking down mutants, trying to destroy them, and the tables have turned. But it's in no small thanks to Cyclops and really a few other people. But the main threat is no longer Orchis. Now, the main threat is Nimrod. Why? Because while Nimrod was created by Orchis as a sentinel that was highly adaptable with the ability to detect mutant powers and to develop countermeasures to those powers based off the Nimrod that originally appeared in Days of Future Past, the fact is, Nimrod had been working behind the scenes, that it had been working to use or to kind of utilize its own AI technology to kind of achieve godhood. Remember, that's one of the things that Marvel's established recently. I don't really know how I feel about it. It seems like a grandiose series of events that will effectively go nowhere. But what Marvel established here are what were called dominions, basically the end result of what happens when an artificial intelligence learns everything there is to learn about every form of power that exists. Power belonging to magic, mutant powers, powers of the cosmic side, so Galactus, the Celestials, all that kind of stuff, and in utilizing all those powers, transcends everything in the universe and moves into a kind of multiversal entity that travels from one universe to the next, eating up all the knowledge available and then wiping out the whole universe in the process. That's what Nimrod looks to achieve here. Right, that's what it's hoping to attain. Now, the reason why Marvel's doing this is because it's just kind of Marvel's way of saying, like, we don't like AI, right? That's really what the whole message is communicating, but it's still a cool concept, right? Because what you get here is a meeting between Charles Xavier and Nimrod. And this almost never really happens because, again, Nimrod is traditionally a sentinel that destroys mutants. And that's it. That's all it ever really does. But this version of Nimrod is wholly unique and a lot more interesting. And so the two of them essentially strike a deal. Now, this is one of those moments in Marvel Comics that shows the kind of nefarious side of Charles Xavier. And there's all kinds of moments like that in Marvel. You could argue that the conversation between Cyclops and Professor Xavier during the events of Avengers vs. X-Men reveal the kind of darker and more nefarious side of Professor X. The story X-Men Deadly Genesis, which we have done, and you'll find a link to that in the description, that's definitely an instance of Professor Xavier being nefarious. But the bigger point here is he makes a kind of backdoor deal. Cyclops will learn about it in this comic, and he will get pissed, right? You have a conversation here where Xavier basically says that his dream is Krakoa, a nation where mutants can be free from the persecution of humanity. But this also extends to the persecution of like Nimrod and AI and all that kind of stuff. And so the deal that's struck here is do what you will with the human race. If you want to destroy them, destroy them. If you want to enslave them, enslave them. All that I ask is you leave the mutant population alone. And as the kind of de facto leader of the mutant population, I will tell them to stand down against you. And as a display of good faith, the humans are about to launch a nuclear-powered ship to your destination with the attempt to destroy you. I will take care of it. And so before you get to what happens next, you actually transition over to Apocalypse. Now, Apocalypse is yet another part of the equation here, where he's also leading a kind of attack, or at least marshaling forces in an effort to kind of stave off any future conflict that's going to be coming along. Because again, you don't really have Orchis as a major threat. And so his main focus in the here and now is actually Krakoa, because while Krakoa itself is technically an island, it does have a kind of sentient mind, right? It is an actual core being. It's literally a tree. Like, not even lying, Groot. The similarities are striking here. But as we also know from Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run, the Krakoan island itself feeds off the energy of mutants in order to survive. Now, because there were so many mutants living on the nation of Krakoa, it was like a drop of blood from each person, as opposed to draining all the blood from one person. So the amount of energy it was absorbing was minuscule, and it was small enough that nobody ever really noticed it. But because there are so few mutants left now, and there are so few mutants in the presence of Apocalypse, what has to happen is sacrifices must be made. There are mutants that are going to have to basically finish all their living in order to feed their life energy directly into Krakoa. Apocalypse basically cuts himself and kind of bleeds in a little bit in order to demonstrate that he is of good faith in doing this. It's also because Apocalypse is kind of necessary, right? It's not one of these situations where it's like rules for thee, not for me. It's one of these things where it's just kind of like, I mean, I'm sort of needed here. And plus, like, the amount of energy that I can give it is more than enough if I just cut my hand. But it's also kind of the principle of the thing, right? If we are going to be a unified race, and if we are truly going to say we stand for something, then our actions must match our convictions. It's not like people on Twitter where you just say stuff, right? I mean, you have to actually match what you're saying. And so what you get here is Apocalypse that asks people to step forward. And people do, right? Now, of course, he kills them on the spot, and their life energy, quite literally their blood, is put into Krakoa, and he in turn just drinks it, and it just starts to satiate him. It goes on and on and on like that with all these various people. It's a little dark and a little twisted, but kind of interesting at the same time. And it's also a little sad and a little tragic, because what you get here is one of these mutants by the name of Wrongslide. And this guy just kind of says, like, he recognizes that in this fight between himself and Apocalypse, that Apocalypse is holding back. The response of Apocalypse himself is he says, "You remind me of that lost land and the man I was. You hold wonder in your heart, and above all, you treasure life. But life requires death." So Apocalypse is kind of holding back because there's a part of him that can't quite bring himself to end this guy's life knowing what he stands for. Because the reality here is that in what could often be considered a fairly dark world, the preservation of beautiful and wonderful and incredible people seemingly has to be maintained above all else. Otherwise, all that's left is darkness. And so to kind of snuff one of these lives out, knowing the significance that comes with it, is no small thing. And that's why Apocalypse grants him an honorable death, right? He says, "You fought well, Wrongslide." And Wrongslide says, "I have a last wish." And the response of Apocalypse, "Speak it so that it may be true." He doesn't dismiss him. He doesn't say, like, well, there'll be time for that later on, right? And then just like kill the guy. He says, "Speak it, and it'll become a reality." And so what Wrongslide says is, if you see Santo, if you see Rockslide again, tell him for me, it was so good to be for a while. It was good to exist. As short as my life was, I am glad to have lived it. And so ultimately Apocalypse destroys this guy. And it's a very, very difficult thing for him to do. Again, given the significance of what he's doing, destroying a beautiful thing in an otherwise non-beautiful world. And so in turn, the energies from Wrongslide are enough to basically bring Krakoa back, to restore it back to where it was before. And then at that point, you switch back over to what's going on with regards to Nimrod and the rest of the X-Men. And just to give you guys perspective here, Nimrod is more than enough. In fact, he holds his own against the combined forces of Rogue and Colossus. And that's pretty incredible. I mean, it's pretty astounding that he's able to do that. He even just kind of muses while he's doing it. He says, "I must assign you wretches a certain amount of credit. We knew you would attack, but not that you would teleport your entire station into Sentinel City." Right? So it's like you kind of caught us by surprise, but fat difference it's going to make because you can't stop us. I mean, this guy cold cocks Colossus in one hit. Rogue is taken out by a blast of energy from the chest. I mean, it's just nuts how quickly these guys are subdued. None of them can seemingly stand a chance here. But that's when you wind back to a conversation between Xavier and Cyclops, because Xavier goes into the mind of Cyclops and kind of tells him what's going on. Now, Cyclops freaks, but Xavier says, "It's not what you think, Scott. Please. Hard choices have to be made. I need latitude. I've made a deal." The response of Cyclops, "Like the deal you made with them the night of the gala when so many mutants were killed." Because from Cyclops' perspective, he doesn't know there's an army of mutants 250,000 strong, just waiting in the wings for the chance to be recalled and brought back to life. Not all of them will make it, but more than 50% of them will. The response to Cyclops, "We could have won. You cut a backroom deal again, and we all just have to live with it. So you decide who lives and dies. Cut to the end, Charles. Who gets to live? Who's dying? Anybody I know, anybody I love. The response of Xavier, I had hoped you would understand, because for Charles Xavier, the ends justify the means. And he's not entirely wrong here, right? Cyclops would happily send the entirety of the mutant population to their death going down swinging than to make some backdoor deal with his mortal enemy. Whereas Xavier is looking at the bigger picture, right? Of what use is any of this if none of us survive, right? Like, survival is really more important sometimes. And sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So I cut a deal because it's how we live. I'm sorry that you don't necessarily approve, but that's the beauty of the difference between you and me. You don't need to approve, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so what he does is he seizes control of one of the minds of the guys who were on this nuclear ship, and he forces the guy to arm the nuclear arsenal on this ship, and it blows the entire ship apart. And Cyclops is forced to watch this entire thing unfold. And it's yet another instance, a kind of dagger, where Cyclops loses trust in Xavier yet again, right? Where he just doesn't see him as a reliable and trustworthy guy. And so jumping back to this massive conflict between Cyclops and Colossus and Rogue and all these guys against Nimrod, Nimrod says, I must dedicate more thought to this. Are there places yet undiscovered where I can keep killing? What am I when the task is accomplished? And that's when you have Karima, right? Omega Sentinel, who says, we have a couple of problems. Nightcrawler is aboard Sentinel City, and he's sabotaging repair efforts, and a powerful storm is heading this way. The response of Nimrod, well, we are near this solar system's sun, and that's where Karima chimes in, and she says, the storm is not coming from the sun, it's coming from Earth. And so what you get is like this really amazing statement from Storm. And she says, it is said that in space, screams go unheard. However, that's untrue. If one is able to cocoon oneself in oxygen and lightning, then blister across the void in a solar tempest. If you can do that, then your scream of vengeance will ring across the galaxy. Because remember, Storm is back from the land of the dead with Magneto, and she is incensed and more powerful than she's ever been. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.